In this compilation video, I invite you to revisit some of the cases featuring alien abduction and UFO sightings featured on my channel in 2024. Enjoy. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. It was the 19th of August 1979, and a 36-year-old Linda Jones was picking wildflowers with her two children, 15-year-old Dawn and 5-year-old Andrew. They had just waved goodbye to a friend, accompanying them as far as Simon's Bridge, along the River Mersey in the English suburb of Didsbury, Manchester. It was a 15-minute walk back home, but there was no hurry, the family taking their time to identify and admire the various flora to be found in the long grass of the riverbank. And yet, as peaceful as it was meant to be, the Jones family's evening walk turned out to be anything but, when an object 60 feet wide and the shape of the crescent moon raced across the sky above them, seemingly on a direct collision course with the riverbank. What followed next was a close encounter of the second kind, and, as strange events and regression sessions over the next 18 months seemed to indicate, quite possibly even of the fourth kind, an alien abduction. That evening marking the beginning of a series of terrifying events that saw Linda Jones, a self-described ordinary, down-to-earth human being, become embroiled in an extraterrestrial-plagued nightmare from which she was unable to wake. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. In various statements and interviews in the years since her experience, Linda Jones has been able to describe the object that she and her children encountered on the riverbank in the summer of 1979. Initially sighted by her daughter Dawn, the object first appeared to be an aircraft on fire, pinky orange in colour and spinning out of the sky, heading straight towards them. Fearing for their lives, Linda and her children took cover in the long grass, and yet the anticipated explosion as the craft impacted the earth never came. There was only silence. Slowly raising their heads, the trio then observed the object land vertically in a field over a hill. According to Linda's testimony, they subsequently ran up the hill, still expecting to see a plane on fire, only to find a very large object shaped like a half-moon hovering 2 feet off the ground. It was 60 feet across, dark grey, and made of a sort of latticework, a girder structure that enabled Linda and her children to be able to see the field through it. The family was transfixed, not just by the unidentified object that they were witnessing, but also by the eerie silence that seemed to have enveloped them. It was complete stillness, Linda recalled many years later. Not only was the strange craft soundless, but the entire riverbank. No birdsong, no traffic from the nearby motorway. It was as though they were within a bubble. At this point, Linda has described approaching the object. It was, after all, a physical thing, and so unable to believe what she and her children were seeing, she had to get closer for a better look. And yet, as she did, the light from the craft is said to have burnt her face. It was, as she recalled in a later television interview, too bright. A cry of fear from her daughter, and Linda was drawn back to her children. "We didn't look back," she explained years later. "We just ran down the hill and hurried home." And so here ends their peculiar encounter, or so they thought, for when Linda arrived home, she was surprised to find her husband Trevor waiting for them. He had been at work on a 2 to 10 p.m. shift. When he returned home, his family had been missing. And so it was that Linda realised her and her children's riverside walk had resulted in at least an hour of missing time. She and her children had left the house with their friend at 7:30, had walked for 15 minutes to reach the bridge and then turned back for home, meandering along the riverbank, looking at wildflowers until around 9, when they saw the object. It was past 10 o'clock by the time they made it home. Given that they had run all the way, there was simply no accounting for it. The following day, the Jones family realised even more strangeness. Speaking in a television interview some years later, Trevor recalled how the skin under his wife's eyes was all red, like it had been scorched by the next morning. Burnt and scaly, the damage extended to her eyelids. Not only that, both Linda and Dawn developed strange marks on their legs over the next few days. The youngest child, Andrew, was unaffected. He did, however, report something else. Horrifyingly vivid nightmares in which men with heads shaped like raindrops were coming for him. Such a disturbing detail provides an insight into the undertone of horror that can be said to haunt the Didsbury case. After all, whilst the story began with wildflowers and summer sunsets, all was very much not as it seemed that August evening. Not only did Linda and her children witness an unidentified flying object, they seem to have also encountered something so distinctly terrifying that it made them fear for their very lives. Indeed, researchers Philip Mantle and Carl Nagaitis, through their 2002 edition of Without Consent, reveal how Linda's 15-year-old daughter had been so petrified by the riverside experience that she had wet herself and needed to change upon returning home. Not only that, in her various testimonies, Linda has spoken of how her life flashed before her eyes, with her fearing that this was Judgment Day. In her mind, at least, the encounter was biblical, and might have very well ended in the annihilation of her children, and quite possibly even the entire world. Hence why she, scooping 5-year-old Andrew up from the grass, didn't stop running until they were safely home. They were too terrified to look back. They felt as though they were being pursued. In short, something about that experience made them feel as though their lives were in danger. And so, what had Linda and her children seen that evening? And why did it take them over an hour to run the short distance home? In some way, answers can be said to have arrived in the form of hypnotic regression and the sessions that Linda was convinced to undergo some 18 months later. Each of the hypnosis sessions was recorded onto videotape, resulting in a total of 10 hours of footage. 10 hours of deeply distressing footage, so distressing in fact that after just watching a small sample, Linda was left so traumatized that she was unable to watch anymore. I find it very hard to accept what I actually said under hypnosis, Linda stated during an appearance on the British audience participation talk show The Time, The Place. After all, she had no conscious memory of any of it. According to her regression sessions, when she and her children ran away from the hovering craft, they saw a person standing by the object. A man in dark clothing, the figure was tall and had dark eyes. After that, Linda recalled a sensation of floating and then being on a table in a strange room. 6 beings come in, she shared via her witness testimony in Mantle and Nagaitis' book. They were humanoid and dressed in some sort of jumpsuit, like motorbike suits with high necks. As for the beings' faces, they were said to have all looked the same, with slanted eyes, very dark hair, and yellow olive skin. In another of Linda's interviews, in which she appeared alongside her husband Trevor, she even went so far as to describe the beings as having big, almond-shaped eyes. Arguably most terrifying, however, was her belief that she knew one of them. She doesn't know how, when, or why, but it seemed as if she had seen him before. Continuing to piece together the events through her hypnotic regression sessions, Linda claims that she was then subjected to some sort of tabletop medical examination. I distinctly remember them putting something on my legs, she has explained. It felt cold, like pieces of ice. If true, such may help to explain why she, and horrifyingly her 15-year-old daughter also, suffered from strange marks on their legs in the days after their sighting. And if all of this was not horrific enough, according to her testimony, Linda also went on to suffer real-world medical side effects in the weeks and months after her close encounter. She experienced chronic fatigue, and her menstrual cycle was affected. So much so that she was forced to undergo a series of hospital appointments and tests. Ultimately, and to her disbelief, her doctor told her that she had internal scarring consistent with an ectopic pregnancy. Linda had not been pregnant since the birth of her son Andrew some 5 years prior. Not only that, an ectopic pregnancy can be fatal and would have necessitated medical attention, something which, again, Linda had not experienced. I would have known, she asserted in one of her interviews. I don't know what happened to me, but something did. All of this resulted in her very much questioning lots of other events in her life, as well as why all of this had happened to her and her children. To be honest, it frightens me, she revealed to Mantle and Nagaitis for their book. After all, she had no recollection of what happened that August evening, and perhaps was never meant to have had any for her own mental well-being. Looking at the Didsbury abduction as a whole, it is very easy to draw lines between this case and others which report similar happenings. Missing time, for example, can be said to be synonymous with alien abduction cases. That such missing time is recovered via hypnotic regression is, again, consistent with other reports. In this way, it can be said to be interesting to consider Linda's personal background prior to her experience. After all, according to one of her interviews, she had no knowledge or interest in UFOs or anything science fiction before her experience. Indeed, when analysing some of the terminology she uses to describe her encounter, it is interesting to note how her mind turned first to religious imagery, such as the Day of Judgment, before that typically associated with UFOs and alien craft. Such is not only compelling in terms of the authenticity of Linda's testimony, but also once again aligns her with other alleged alien abductees, in particular John and Elaine Avis, who experienced 3 hours of missing time after encountering a UFO in 1974 in Aveley, Essex. In this instance, the 2 researchers involved in the case, Andrew Collins and Barry King, are reported to have subjected John and Elaine to a series of questions about UFOs and extraterrestrials so as to assess how much they knew about the subject matter. They, so Collins and King concluded, had very limited and non-specific knowledge. Not only that, the concept of missing time being connected to their sighting of the UFO was entirely novel to them. All of this suggests that, far from being reported solely by deranged individuals desperate to believe in the otherworldly, alien abductions are instead often associated with perfectly ordinary or, as Linda expressed it, down-to-earth people with no prior inclination towards extraterrestrial subject matter. With this firmly in mind, it can then be said to be overwhelming to consider the entire network of similarities in Linda's testimony to that of other cases. Missing time, rashes and burns on her skin after exposure to the craft, the horrific medical aftermath, even potentially the location of her encounter. For indeed, in a recent piece written for Fortean Times magazine, veteran UFO researcher and author Jenny Randalls considered the recurring connection between rivers, missing time, and alien abduction, drawing attention not merely to the role of the River Mersey in Linda Jones's 1979 experience, but to other cases also, such as the infamous Pascagoula abduction, which saw 2 men experience strange craft and creatures whilst fishing off a pier on the west bank of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. Even from my own experience of interviewing UAP observers and potential abductees, including Welsh native Helena Worth, connections between UFOs and rivers, in Helena's case the River Eron, have been proposed. Certainly, as Randalls concludes in her article, there are multiple cases adjacent to major rivers. Indeed, in one sensational television appearance, Linda was actually hypnotically regressed live in the studio, with the hypnotist afterwards reporting that, under hypnosis and in a state of extreme terror, she had recalled seeing a ball coming out of the river very, very slowly on the day that she saw the UFO, firmly connecting whatever happened to her that day in Didsbury to the River Mersey. Here then, it is arguably fascinating, and indeed somewhat unnerving, to consider yet further connections to water, ones which stretch us out into the wider world of the paranormal. After all, in addition to being related to missing time and alien abduction, such as in Linda Jones's experience, water is also said to play a role in poltergeist-accredited phenomena. Thinking of the infamous Black Monk of 30 East Drive and the poltergeist activity reported there by the Pritchard family in the late 1960s, there are claims that there is an old well and thus a direct connection to an underground watercourse underneath the property. Considering this, many believe that water has the ability to amplify spiritual energy, as it may be easier for ghosts, spirits, and other ethereal or interdimensional beings to travel through liquids, as opposed to solid objects or gases like air. In this way, one might consider how electricity interacts with water. It is an excellent conductor. Might it therefore be an excellent conductor for strangeness also, whether that be of a ghostly or extraterrestrial sort? All very thought-provoking, if a little too wild for those with conservative tastes. After all, such suggests that there might not be much difference between aliens and ghosts, ETs and spirit entities, and that when we speak of the other side, that other side might be rather a lot larger and rather a lot more populated than we might first think. Linda Jones was very adamant that the still and soundless craft that she saw that day in Didsbury was a physical object. But given how efficiently it seems her memories have been scrubbed and concealed, even from her own mind, we simply cannot say what she saw, or to what realm or dimension it may have belonged. It was 1967, and a 26-year-old Second Lieutenant Robert Salas was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls, Montana. It was the early hours of the morning of the 24th of March, and he was on duty as the Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander. His task was to monitor the status of the Oscar Flight missiles, a series of nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles designed to defend the United States in the case of nuclear attack as part of the Minuteman program. It was a Cold War policy, one which was hoped would never be required. And yet, by the time the sun rose that morning, Oscar Flight had been attacked by foreign invaders, with Robert Salas and other military personnel claiming that those who had done the attacking did so via extraterrestrial aircraft, and had the capability not merely to take multiple nuclear missiles offline at the Oscar Flight launch facility, but to trigger a sudden no-go shutdown of silos at another site also, with the military to this day unable to conclude how or why the strange illuminated craft were able to do so, and what this might mean for mankind's ability to defend itself against alien invaders. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. It is no small thing to say that the United States' nuclear capabilities were shut down by extraterrestrials, and yet this is precisely what Robert Salas and many others stationed at both Oscar and Echo flights in the 1960s have claimed. According to Salas's testimony, recorded in his and researcher James Klotz's 2005 book Faded Giant, he was underground in Oscar Flight's Launch Control Center capsule when he received a call from a topside airman. He, along with a few others, had seen strange lights in the early morning sky. When Salas asked him what kind of lights they were, he is said to have replied that they weren't aircraft. Rather, they had been making some strange maneuvers, zigzagging across the clear night sky, suggesting they may have been UFOs. Thinking that they were simply playing a prank, Salas thus told the airman to keep an eye on the lights and let him know if they got any closer, before hanging up and returning to reading his book. A mere minute or two later, a second call came through. There was, so an audibly frightened non-commissioned security officer relayed, a UFO hovering outside the front gate. It was like a big red-orange ball, so bright that it was hard to get a good look at it. The security officer was instructed to secure the site and phone command post. Meanwhile, Salas went to wake his commander, Lieutenant Fred Maywald, who had been on a scheduled sleep period. As Salas began to brief him, alarms are said to have sounded throughout the underground capsule. There was a problem with the nuclear-tipped ICBMs. A no-go light had appeared on the commander's console, stating that one of the missile sites had gone offline and was now inoperable. Seconds later, a second alarm went off. Another no-go and another inoperable missile. Within the next few seconds, some 10 missiles were lost to a no-go condition. As Salas and Maywald scrambled to begin their query procedure so as to determine the cause of the missile shutdowns, the above-ground personnel rushed to respond to the security breach caused by the UFO. It was, however, already gone, somehow disappeared. The security team dispatched to respond were therefore directed to return to the launch control facility. In a written testimony provided by Fred Maywald some years later, two very upset young men wasted no time getting back inside. For certainly, whatever they had seen that night upset them so greatly that one of the men had to be released from further duty as a security guard. And so it was, in the chaos of nuclear shutdown, Salas, Maywald and others attempted to get the missiles back online. Salas has described in some detail the checklist procedure that they went through so as to determine that they were not operational due to some inexplicable reason. After all, power had not been lost, and there was no other obvious fault or reason for the shutdown. Not only that, after reporting what had happened to Command Post, the men learnt that the same kind of missile shutdowns had happened at Echo Flight, another nuclear-tipped ICBM site in the Minuteman program. And, sensationally, it was claimed that, in an eerie imitation of the events at Oscar Flight, a UFO had been seen hovering over that site also. All in all, the strike capability of nearly 20 nuclear missiles had been lost. In the aftermath of the inexplicable shutdown, a missile maintenance squadron had to be called in to get the missiles back online. In the end, they remained out of service for an entire day, with reports of UFOs once again plaguing the launch facilities. Indeed, many of the base's security guards were called to stand watch, with some, including airman Roberto Morales, later going on record to describe the strangeness he observed. "It started getting dark on us," Morales reported to researcher James Klotz during a July 2001 interview. "We were watching the lights in the sky. They would streak, and then they would stop, going back and forth." In the airman's opinion, they were not Air Force. The way that they were travelling was too erratic, too strange. In short, impossible. Fascinatingly, Morales' testimony can be said to match those of others present in the site. In addition to Robert Salas sharing how he was informed by topside personnel that the strange lights had been zigzagging and making other strange maneuvers in the sky, an anonymous military technician has revealed that he not only witnessed UFOs in the area while the missiles were being brought back online, but that the strange light craft had actively interfered with the process of reactivating them. At this point in the narrative, it must once again be stressed just how incredible all of this is. For indeed, not merely is it being suggested by several named and on-the-record USAF personnel that unidentified aircraft played a part in the shutdown of American nuclear missile systems, but that they were able to frustrate and hinder their reactivation for an entire day. And so, if one is to even begin entertaining such a sensational, far-reaching consequence-producing possibility, it is absolutely necessary to analyse the evidence. And certainly, military personnel like Robert Salas would agree. So much so, in fact, that for the past 29 years, since his retirement in 1995, he has dedicated himself to disclosure, speaking publicly, publishing books and presenting records and documents. As recently as February 2023, he spoke with the freshly established All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, an office within the US Department of Defense created to investigate unidentified flying objects and other air, sea, land and space UAPs. On the phone with the office for 2 hours, Salas briefed them of the Oscar Flight incident, revealing in a later newspaper interview that he went through all the details extensively, even providing them with 22 pieces of documentary evidence. Included within this would have been testimonies and written reports from the engineers summoned to the site in the aftermath of the 1967 shutdown. After all, they had been unable to identify any significant failures, engineering data or findings that would explain why the event occurred. In the words of Robert Kaminsky, the Boeing company engineer contracted for the Minuteman missile system, the happening was rare and not encountered before, with his team made up of qualified engineers and technicians headed by scientists spending a week in the field in order to assess and test all possibilities, without significant result. And as if this wasn't strange and concerning enough, just as the engineering team began to prepare their final report, they encountered another oddity, a stop work order. According to Kaminsky, their Air Force liaison instructed them not to submit the final engineering report, as it had been decided that all further efforts on this project must cease. This, explained Kaminsky in his written testimony, was most unusual, since all of our work required review by the customer and the submittal of a final engineering report to the team's liaise, Ogden Air Materiel Command. Such can be said to be a perfect expression of this entire case: secrecy and concealment. In this way, it is not surprising that Robert Salas regarded his 2023 phone call with the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office as a milestone. After all, for all that he and others had experienced that March, the light anomalies, the UFO at the gate, the nuclear shutdown, he had never previously had the chance to tell his story to a government office. They had simply not wanted to know. More than that, he had been explicitly instructed never to speak of the immediately classified incident ever again, being made to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Because of this, it has taken many years, decades in fact, for the full package of information, testimony and documentation to come to light. The Freedom of Information Act was able to crowbar much of the information out of government hands, with the rest being supplied by military witnesses and whistleblower testimonies. Even then, there is still some measure of confusion as to precisely when and how certain things took place, with Salas and co-author James Klotz in their book Faded Giant being the first to admit the fallibility of human memory when they stated that, because of conflicting memories, some uncertainty exists whether, in fact, the Echo and Oscar flight missile shutdown incidents occurred on the same morning or on different days within a short time. Decades after the original incidents, with the clarity of time and declassification, it seems that there had indeed been a similar occurrence of UFO-triggered nuclear shutdown at Echo flight, occurring a mere 8 days before the Oscar flight incident on the 16th of March. In a 2023 newspaper interview, Salas also revealed that he had learnt of 10 ICBMs being disabled under yet again identical circumstances in September 1966 at the Minnow Air Force Base in North Dakota. Because of this, Salas has been clear to say that, in no uncertain terms, within a span of 6 months, we lost 30 nuclear missiles to UFOs. Indeed, a now declassified Air Force communication document relating to the Echo flight shutdown even went so far as to state that the fact that no apparent reason for the loss of 10 missiles can be readily identified is cause for grave concern at this headquarters. Here, I would go even further. It is a cause for grave concern for all humanity. After all, not merely was the most advanced weaponry on Earth at that given moment shut down inexplicably and in a matter of seconds, not merely did numerous on-the-record military personnel see UFOs and light anomalies in the lead-up, occurrence and aftermath of both the Echo and Oscar flight shutdowns, not merely did civilians report multiple similar sightings, including of a large, fast-moving dome-shaped light in the weeks before and after the incidents, but some at the heart of the shutdowns, including Robert Salas, went on to experience further and far more intrusive extraterrestrial contact. By this I of course mean abduction, that horrific place where all journeys seem to end in alien phenomena. Before we go any further, it is necessary to stress that Robert Salas, both in his writings and countless spoken interviews and podcast appearances, is a highly intelligent, highly eloquent individual with a strong inclination towards the facts. His books read like military reports. They are military reports, footnoted with extensive bibliographies and impressive appendix sections stuffed full of documentary evidence. His own personal experiences are therefore secondary. They cannot be footnoted, they cannot be evidenced via diagrams and Freedom of Information Act revelations. Even so, he has tentatively opened up about his abduction experiences, most explicitly in the purposefully penultimate chapter of his 2015 book, Unidentified, the UFO Phenomenon. He explains how he first became aware that he was being abducted in 1985, some 18 years after the Oscar flight incident, when he and his wife Marilyn were living in Manhattan Beach, California, with their 2 children. One night, he woke suddenly, disturbed by a light coming from their living room. The light was a strange color of blue and seemed to be drifting into the bedroom. Salas recalls waking his wife, fearing that there was an intruder in the house. And yet, as Salas tried to get out of bed and confront whoever was in his family's home, he found that he was paralyzed. Not merely that, as he struggled to turn his head, arms and legs pinned in place, he saw that his wife had gone back to sleep. Helpless and stuck, it was at this moment that Salas allegedly noticed a figure in the bedroom doorway. It was dark and seemed to have a hood over its head. What happened next can, in many ways, be described as a typical, terrifying abduction experience. Salas recalls lifting off his bed, floating towards the window, then somehow through it, before finding himself in a craft. There he was forcibly subjected to a painful medical procedure, which involved the insertion of a very long, needle-like instrument into his groin. Prior to insertion, he claims that he received some manner of telepathic message that it would not hurt. A reassurance which turned out to be a lie. The pain was, so Salas has explained, extreme. When he complained about it, it was then relieved. He does not know why they did this, neither can he say for certain that this was his first or only abduction experience. In fact, speaking with his wife about his memories in the years afterwards, he is as certain as he can be that they had more than one such encounter. In his own words, "I have no doubt that I was taken, and I am not sure whether I want to know what else transpired during that encounter." It is easy to understand why. This is something that we encounter time and time again in abduction testimonies. Careless, callous, non-consensual behavior. We can and should criticize governments, US and around the globe, for the concealment of information regarding our planet and the possibility of extraterrestrial information, but we should not fall into the trap of believing that the other side is any better. After all, for an extraterrestrial race with such effortless nuke-nullifying capabilities, announcing their presence to a global audience should be utterly unburdensome. And so, why haven't they? Why instead do they, if all these testimonies are to be believed, prefer to lurk in the shadows, forcibly abducting people, removing them from their homes so as to experiment upon them medically? Considering Robert Salas's alleged abduction and the lie of a pain-free experience, they should be interpreted as either stupid, careless, or outright malevolent, or even a terrifying mix of all three. Let it be said, technological advancement, the easy ability to shut down multiple nuclear ICBMs, does not equate with emotional intelligence. Telepathy is little more than a party trick. If all that has been covered in this video and others published on this channel is correct, we should be wary. We should be asking questions. This case goes beyond the military, beyond the United States. It affects us all. As Robert Salas rightly states in the introduction of his book Faded Giant, in a free society, we all bear some responsibility for the suppression of truth. To that I shall add that this is even more the case when the truth may be difficult to swallow. Belief in angels is on the rise. According to a 1993 survey conducted by Time magazine, 2/3 of Americans admit belief in their existence, with 1/3 claiming personal experience of an angelic presence. A more recent poll, published by the Associated Press, places belief as high as 7 out of 10. By way of contrast, fewer US adults believe in the devil and demons, meaning angels are, to many of us, more real than the horrors of devilish minions and satanic hellfire. Such a statement will no doubt come as a surprise to many, especially when one considers the view of Doctors Rupert Sheldrake and Matthew Fox, the biologist and the priest who jointly wrote the 1996 book The Physics of Angels. In the modern day, while science and religion rarely agree on anything, they can at least find common ground in regards to angels. They are an embarrassment to the good sense and integrity of both disciplines. But why? We have already acknowledged that, as a species, most of us believe in or even assert having had personal interaction with angelic beings. Throughout history, it has been much the same, with those who do not believe consistently finding themselves in the minority. Even when we set aside traditional Western understandings of angels and consider them at a global level, we find these same beings, celestial messenger spirits who both minister and protect everywhere, simply under different names. Indeed, it might even be said that there are parallels to be found in ufology. non-human, light-associated entities descending from the sky with messages to give. It is perhaps then no coincidence that the revival of interest in angels seems to mirror an expansion of interest in UFOs and extraterrestrials. The majority of us seem to know that something is happening in the heavens above, with one sensational and well-revered story, today remembered as the miracle of the sun, doing much to suggest that, in some cases at least, angels and extraterrestrials might not be that different after all. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. In the spring of 1916, a 9-year-old Lucia dos Santos and her two cousins, Francisco and Jacinta Mato, were herding sheep near their home in Portugal. Such work was not unusual for children in the early 20th century, and so they took it in their stride, the three of them playing together as they watched over the livestock, rotating them through the small plots of land owned by their parents in the different parts of the mountainous plateau on which the village of Fatima stood. Lucia, Francisco and Jacinta were therefore amusing themselves with one of their usual games when something strange is said to have happened. According to Lucia's memoir, written some time later, a strong wind began to shake the trees of the olive grove in which they were playing. Their attention roused by the sudden gust, the children are then said to have turned their heads to see what was happening. There, in the distance, above the trees that stretched to the east, a light whiter than snow is said to have appeared. It was in the form of a young man, quite transparent and as brilliant as crystal in the rays of the sun. The children were transfixed and watched as the figure came closer. When he did, he supposedly spoke, saying, "Do not be afraid, I am an angel of peace." He then instructed the young trio to pray. With what Lucia described as a supernatural impulse, they did just that, with the bright and luminous man guiding them through a prayer which, he said, would, if repeated, bring Jesus and Mary to them. After that, the crystalline apparition disappeared, leaving the children shocked and, so Lucia wrote, locked in silence. Indeed, according to her memoir, his words sank so deeply into our minds that we never forgot them, and ever after we used to spend long periods on our knees repeating them, sometimes until we fell down exhausted. Even so, later that same year, when the illuminated figure appeared again before the children, he is said to have chastised them for their lack of spiritual discipline. They must, so he supposedly said, offer prayers and sacrifices to God, in reparation for the sins by which he is offended. In that way, so the bright and transparent man went on, the children would bring peace to our country, namely Portugal, of which the figure claimed to be the guardian angel. After this, he once again disappeared. And so it went on, the children praying and offering reparation for the outrages, sacrileges, and indifferences by which God is offended, sometimes by themselves, and at other times with the strange light of the angel shining over them. Then, many months later, on the 13th of May the following year, a lady dressed in white is said to have appeared before the children. Lucia was now 10 years old, Francisco 8, and Jacinta 7, and they were pasturing their sheep in a hilly depression owned by Lucia's father, known as the Cove of Irene. Oddly, for the day was otherwise clear, they were startled to see a flash of lightning, immediately after which a lady dressed in white appeared atop an oak tree. She is reported as having shone brighter than the sun, giving out rays of clear and intense light so bright that the children, even at a distance of about 5 feet, found themselves within it. When the illuminated woman spoke, she said, "Please don't be afraid of me. I'm not going to harm you." When the children asked her where she was from, she said heaven, and then proceeded to explain that she would return again to them, even providing them a date, and that, just as the angel before had mentioned, it was very important that they pray and make sacrifices in order to repair the damages that sinners were currently wreaking on earth. In this way, she supposedly made reference to the Great War that was currently, unbeknownst to the young children, raging in Europe. bring peace to the world, she told them, and an end to the war. At that, the illuminated woman is said to have risen slowly in the direction of the east until she disappeared in the immense distance, the light which encircled her seeming to make a way amidst the stars. With the arrival of this second apparition, the children were no longer able to keep their experiences secret, and so the youngest, 7-year-old Jacinta revealed what she and her brother and cousin had seen to her parents. And so, by the time the date which the lady in white had named as the date of her next appearance arrived, the 3 children were joined by a small crowd of people. They spoke with the illuminated woman again, with her message somewhat eerily, this time being that it would soon be time for her to take Francisco and Jacinta to heaven. As for Lucia, so the ethereal woman said, you will remain a little longer. There was, after all, still work to be done on Earth. As for the others present, it is recorded that they knew that something unusual had occurred, with testimonies alternating between the witnessing of strange lightning, the perceiving of a certain dimming of the sun, and also of the appearance of a little grey cloud that came and went as the apparition did. By the end of 1917, the lady supposedly visited the children 4 more times. It was during her final visit of the year, on the 13th of October, that she claimed to be the Lady of the Rosary. It was also on that occasion that between 50 and 70,000 spectators witnessed a sensational event now known as the Miracle of the Sun. Specifically, a fantastical display of multicolored lights in the sky which culminated in the sun or some other great wheel of fire detaching itself from its place in the sky so as to fall upon all those who had gathered to witness the apparition. This miraculous and by all accounts heart-stopping happening was extensively documented due to the vast numbers of people who, on the guidance of the 3 children who announced the date given to them by the lady for her next appearance, had travelled from all over to see what was promised to be a spectacular event. In the words of one journalist, one could see the immense multitude turn towards the sun, which appeared free from the clouds and in its zenith. It looked like a plaque of dull silver, and it was possible to look at it without the least discomfort. The sun then trembled and made sudden, incredible movements outside all cosmic laws. The sun danced. It whirled on itself like a giant Catherine wheel that lowered itself to the earth as if to burn it in its rays. Another testimony, this time from Maria de Capellinha, one of the earliest followers of the apparitions, described how the sun turned everything to different colours, yellow, blue and white, before shaking, trembling and falling to the earth. Everything was still and quiet, reported the father of Jacinta and Francisco, and then it began to move and to dance in the sky until it seemed to detach itself from its place and fall upon us. It was a terrible moment. Many in the crowd who observed the happening thought they were about to perish, and that the great, trembling, falling light in the sky would crush them. Many even began to pray and confess their sins aloud. When at last the sun stopped leaping and moving, so a witness explained, we all breathed our relief. Others who were present that day described the appearance as being akin to a dull silver disc. Others again referenced the immensity of its strongly radiating heat. Many were struck by the still and soundless atmosphere that gripped the crowd before it fell. And so, considering this, it is not difficult to understand why one might be immediately tempted to draw comparisons between the miracle of the sun at Fatima and a UFO sighting. Moreover, the more one examines this case, the more one finds similarities not merely to sightings of so-called extraterrestrial craft, but to claims made by alleged alien contactees also. Indeed, the manner in which both the guardian angel of Portugal and the Lady of the Rosary spoke to the children can be said to be reminiscent of the way so-called alien beings are alleged to speak to the humans they interact with. For example, the Lady of the Rosary, who is commonly identified as the Virgin Mary, immediately assured that she was not there to harm the children, and that they therefore had no reason to be afraid of her. The angel, when he first appeared, is reported to have said something similar. Considering alien abductee cases, we are likewise told that the beings stress that they will not cause hurt, even when they then proceed to do precisely that. For example, in the recently explored case of Lieutenant Robert Salas, the dark hooded figure who allegedly abducted him is said to have reassured him telepathically that the medical procedure he was being forced to undergo would not hurt, after which he felt extreme pain. Similar again is the testimony of Calvin Parker in the Pascagoula abduction, with the words "don't be afraid" said to have been transferred from the being to the young man, all without the being's lips moving. Both Parker and his companion that night in 1973, Charles Hickson, reported experiencing pain and even minor wounds on their bodies during their experience. Back to the testimony of the 3 shepherd children of Fatima, it may also then be interesting to consider the prophecy of the Lady of the Rosary, that the 2 youngest children, Francisco and Jacinta, would soon be taken to heaven. According to Lucia's memoir, this message was given on the 13th of June 1917. Less than 3 years later, by February 1920, both young Francisco and Jacinta were dead. Given all that they experienced, the strange and blinding lights, the flashes of supernatural lightning, the rays of clear and intense energy which radiated from the female apparition, one could consider the effects that such exposure might have had on their young and fragile bodies, in a similar way to how, in ufology, the physical effects of being exposed to an alien craft are often explored. In the case of Linda Jones, who reported approaching a hovering craft on the banks of the River Mersey in 1979, she was left with red, burnt and scaly skin on her face the morning after her close encounter. Similar effects are seen in other stories too, with there being abundant testimony and even physical evidence of symptoms and injuries consistent with burns and, in the worst case, radiation sickness after encountering an oddity alleged to have been extraterrestrial. Of course, all of this is massively speculatory. It would be reckless to present this as anything less. And yet, just as it is fascinating to consider why there is a resurgence of belief in angels, it is equally intriguing to draw lines between 2 seemingly separate sets of phenomena. For indeed, angels and other religious occurrences have always been presented as distinctly, for lack of a better word, alien-y. Or, more accurately, alien phenomena often presents as rather angelic. After all, traditional depictions of angels are not white wings and soft feminine faces. They are odd and fiery, or as the medieval German Benedictine abbess, polymath and mystic Hildegard von Bingen worded it, they are living light. They do not have wings like birds, but are still hovering flames. And so, in other words, arguably very similar to modern-day descriptions of UFOs. For biblical Ezekiel, angels, even more strangely, were said to have existed at the center of a brilliantly illuminated windstorm of fire that looked like glowing metal. More broadly, it is also interesting to consider the Book of Miracles, an illustrated manuscript created in Augsburg around the year 1550. It presents many wondrous and eerie phenomena, spiritually attributed, including multiple suns in the sky at the same time, as well as shape-changing stars, strange illuminated manifestations, and other celestial signs. Here, once again, one could argue for a muddling between religious and alien phenomena. And for those skeptical of the Christian framing of the messages given to the shepherd children by the ethereal visitors, the crossover can even be said to work the other way around, with some self-described alien abductees reporting being shown images and films by their abductors that include imagery of Christ on the cross. Often, such encounters will feature an urgent call to action by the alleged alien beings. Namely, the need to protect the planet from pollution, or greed, or war, or generally, well, sin. In the case of the anonymous Avis family, who reported being abducted from their car on their way home in 1974, they completely changed their lifestyle and personal habits after being shown images of humanity's destruction of both the planet and ourselves at a special and personal level. It was, in many ways, a religious conversion experience. A lesser-known case, dating to the same year but in Blacksod, Ireland, describes an encounter that a man had with a brilliant white light in his bedroom. According to the article in Flying Saucer Review in which it is featured, when he was woken by the light, he was surprised to find an angel in his room. A man in white robes who proceeded to fade away. The man got out of bed so as to investigate. On the way to his window, he supposedly saw an object outside. A glowing white craft which started to rise slowly in an easterly direction and, without any noise whatsoever, disappeared into the clouds. In short, an angel in a spaceship. Arguably the most chilling similarity between the Fatima case and abduction phenomena, however, comes when one examines the role of children. For certainly, just as Lucia was told by the ethereal woman from heaven that she had a greater mission to complete on Earth, children involved in alien abductions have been told similar. For example, once again considering the 1974 Averley abduction and the testimonies of the Avises, the family's oldest child, a boy called Kevin, revealed that the beings aboard the craft gave him lots of things to do when he grew up. Speaking with a researcher who documented the case, he expressed that he had forgotten precisely what they said, with it may well being that the information, whatever it was now lodged deep in his subconscious mind for later activation. Similarly, another English case, this time from Kent, centred on a boy called Jason Andrews. The activity, which included the appearance of terrifying watchers in the woods, is said to have heightened on his 4th birthday, when the boy entered a bizarre trance-like state. He appeared to still be asleep and yet spoke oddly, supposedly spewing out an incredible stream of numbers, strange algebraic configurations, mathematical terms like pi and binary codes. After which he attempted to leave the house, stating to his terrified parents that he needed to go because they're waiting for me. Whoever they were, they continued to have an interest in Jason for many years to come, abducting him repeatedly, expressing to him that he had a special mission and that, unsettlingly, he was them and they were him. That is not, of course, to say that we ought to paint angels as horrific, child-abducting alien beings. Certainly, it is in many ways much more appropriate to draw links between religious divine messengers and the aliens of old, specifically those Nordic humanoids more commonly reported in the earlier to mid-decades of the 20th century than in the present day. The ones who, according to testimonies presented by contactees like George Adamski, would politely invite you aboard their craft for a token spin around the heavens, rather than drag you from your bed in the middle of the night so as to strap you to a cold grey table for the purpose of painful medical molestations. Beneficent and not malevolent, angelic and not demonic. Fascinatingly, Adamski even described his experience of being in the presence of one of the otherworldly humanoids as being like the warm embrace of great love and understanding wisdom, a sentiment very similar to that of divine love expressed by Lucia in her Fatima memoir. The extraterrestrial Nordic humanoids were also said to be highly spiritual and concerned with the Earth's ecological condition. Less fascinating and more terrifying is something else that mid-20th century Nordic contactees alleged to have been told, that the Nordics were not the only visitors to Earth. Indeed, another alien species, far less spiritual and emotionally degenerate, if still technologically advanced, had the planet in their sights. It has been speculated that the beings today referred to as the Greys may represent one such species. And so, the notion that there are many players on the board, both good and bad. In this way, one can, if one is so inclined, begin to sort alien contact experiences into 2 piles. Those with beings who say they come in peace and mean it, and those who still say it, but don't. In some way, a mimicry of peace, or, if one would rather, a demon attempting to deceive. For after all, that is what dark preternatural beings are said to do. Lie, trick, and lead astray with the intention of causing harm. The dark demon who impersonates a deceased loved one using a Ouija board. The almond-eyed extraterrestrial who promises a pain-free experience and then proceeds to insert very long and very painful needles into each and every orifice. None of this is a new concept. Researchers and authors have, in the quiet corners of ufology, been talking about this for decades, if not longer. One particularly striking conclusion came from Salvador Freixedo, the Spanish Jesuit and UFO researcher and author. It was his belief that parallels can and should be drawn between the behavior of UFOs and demons, and that just as so-called spacecraft help to prove the reality of many demonic happenings, demonology can help us to understand the possible motives of UFO phenomena. He even went so far as to say that there is a link between the increasing social, political, and religious agitation of the modern day and the ever-mounting number of UFO sightings. The succinct suggestion being that as Nordics have retreated, malevolent, grey-type aliens have invaded, bringing with them their demonic ways. And so, depending upon your appetite for theology, such a concept could paint the subject of ufology as a heavenly-hellish dichotomy. Nordics and similar are angels. Greys and similar are demons. There is even the theory presented by Rupert Sheldrake in his book The Physics of Angels, that angels might feel that by manifesting as UFOs, they'll get through to some people better than in any other form. That they may very well choose to adopt the imagery of science fiction, all while maintaining angelic archetypes that have been widely recognized for centuries. It is, so his co-author Matthew Fox adds, the reconnecting of our imaginations to the spiritual tradition. And so, what of the happenings at Fatima? Do they represent something angelic, something alien, or might these questions simply represent the same thing? Given the descriptions of both the young man, being of light, and the woman from heaven, the Lady of the Rosary, if they were extraterrestrial, they seem to align more with the human appearance of the benevolent aliens of old, encountered by not only the controversial Adamski, but also by other early contactees like Albert Coe. They were not odd, emotionally decrepit, deformed things that made the children fearful. They did not kidnap them. They did not, true to their word, hurt them. In fact, even despite the tragic deaths of 2 of the 3 less than 3 years later, sicknesses which should more properly be attributed to Spanish influenza and tuberculosis than anything extraterrestrial, the Angel of Portugal and the Lady of the Rosary made the children feel tremendously loved. And at the end of the day, that might be all we can count on to be true. What an experience makes us feel, and not necessarily the precise details that explain what it is. The Pascagoula abduction is a classic case of UFO sighting and extraterrestrial abduction. Taking place on the 11th of October 1973, the story centres on Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, aged 42 and 18, on the night that they decided to fish from an old pier of a derelict shipyard on the banks of Mississippi's Pascagoula River. The events that are alleged to have followed are now legendary. Succinctly, the arrival of some manner of soundless, blue-illuminated oval-shaped craft, and the 3 humanoid, grey-coloured, wrinkled-skinned creatures which emerged from it and proceeded to abduct the 2 men. In the decades afterwards, Hickson and Parker struggled both to explain and come to terms with what happened to them that night, with Parker especially regarding the event as some sort of curse, which, along with journalists and thrill-seekers, followed him wherever he went. It wasn't until the later years of his life that he was convinced to revisit that terrible night in 1973 and put down his testimony, complete and unadulterated, in a book. Little did he realize that such would trigger a chain of events that would entirely validate his experience and, more than that, suggest that he and Hickson were not alone in their abduction that night, with the grey, wrinkled creatures they encountered having been seen by others on the other side of the river. Others who claimed that they, too, were abducted, taken on board the same blue illuminated craft so as to be experimented upon and, if their testimonies are to be believed, made unwilling participants in an alien-human hybrid agenda which should terrify us all. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. By October 1973, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker had known each other for a long time. The older man was good friends with the younger's father, with it being usual for the two older men to arrange fishing trips, which included not only Charles's two sons, but a young Calvin also. It was on such trips that Calvin really got to know Charles as a friend and as a person, so much so that, at the age of 18, young and engaged to be married, Calvin found himself asking his father's old friend for help to find a new job. Charles worked on the coast at a shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi, some 2 hours from where Calvin lived. And so, along with a new job, Charles provided his friend's son with a place to live also, renting him a room in his own home until Calvin settled and found a place for himself and his soon-to-be wife. Happy with the plan, Calvin made all the necessary arrangements, starting work in Pascagoula in early October. Just a few days into his new life, on Thursday the 11th, he and Charles arranged to go fishing after work. An old hobby that would bring the two men closer together than either one of them had ever imagined possible. The fishing spot they chose was just off Highway 90 on the Pascagoula River. Choosing an old steel pier to fish from, they settled down with their tackle and bait sometime after 6 p.m. It was a dark but bright night and produced little success. In his book, Calvin described how he was getting fed up and wanted to move on to a better fishing spot when he noticed something big out on the water in front of them. Further examination, and he saw blue, hazy lights akin to a police car. Only it wasn't law enforcement. It was something incredible and entirely unexpected. An oval-shaped craft, about 8 feet high and fairly long, in the shape of a football. Hovering some 2 feet off the ground, it was floating towards the two men on the pier. Examining the testimony of Charles Hickson, originally published in his 1983 book UFO Contact at Pascagoula, the strange craft is described in a similar way. 8 to 10 feet high, hovering, and shaped like a football. It was also said to have been silent, with a small dome-like structure on top and no wings. In short, like no sort of aircraft Charles Hickson had ever seen before. Similar again to Calvin's testimony, the incredible object appeared to be blue, pulsating a blue light as it revolved towards the men across the water. It was then that the craft is said to have lit up really bright, after which some sort of door opened. From this opening, so the men alleged, both at the time and in the decades since, 3 humanoid beings came out towards them. Perhaps the most distinct element of the Pascagoula case, these creatures were said to have been grey with wrinkled skin. Each the same, hovering off the ground similar to the craft, they were around 5 feet tall, with heads that seemed to come directly to the shoulders, and something similar to a nose on either side of the head in the place of ears. Instead of a mouth, they bore a slit, and instead of hands, they boasted a pincer-like appendage rather like the claw of a crab. Terrified, Calvin started screaming. After all, the humanoid creatures were coming for the men and proceeded to grab them and take them on board the illuminated craft. According to their testimonies, neither Calvin nor Charles were able to resist the influence of the beings, with both men going on to have separate and distinctly terrifying abduction experiences. In order to get a better understanding of not just this sensational moment, but also the wider and ongoing story of the Pascagoula abduction, I arranged to speak with eminent UFO researcher and author Philip Mantle, a man who has not merely been involved in the case for many years, but was also the one to convince Calvin Parker to share his story in 2018. Continuing to collaborate with Parker until his death in 2023, Philip also recently published a radical new exploration of the case with co-author Dr. Irena Scott, in which old and new evidence are showcased side by side so as to present a comprehensive, beyond reasonable doubt assessment of that night in 1973. Early on in our conversation, I was able to ask him about the beings that Calvin and Charles alleged to have seen that night, and how they are part of what makes this case not merely compelling, but exceptional in terms of the wider subject matter of UFOs and aliens.
The creatures, the beings, whatever you want to call them, that feature in the Pascagoula case, as far as I'm aware, are unique to it. And I have searched long and hard, around the world, not just in the United States, to see if I can find something similar. The way I look at it from a skeptical point of view, if you were going to hoax this, there was plenty of creatures in science fiction already out there that you could choose from. So, neither gentleman showed any artistic abilities. So, it would have been difficult for them to make this up, is what I'm trying to say. And of course they didn't, but they are very, very, very unique.
And there's lots of specific details as well, like the claw hand that they both mention. It's not just a generic strange creature. They go into the same minor details.
Yeah, right from the very beginning, there is a description of them. It gets refined as the story gets told. We have to remember that. But also, again, right from the off, all of those involved, not just the witnesses, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, but Dr. Hynek was there, Dr. Harder was on site, and others, talked about these creatures as if they were almost robotic.
And so it was, taken on board the craft by these strangely mechanical grey humanoids, that Charles and Calvin each had an abduction experience. In Charles's case, he described being restrained by two of the beings, pain being instantly felt in his left arm, after which he was exposed to a big eye which seemed to come directly out of the interior wall of the craft. The eye 6 inches from his face, he was forced to keep his eyes open as it seemingly examined him. He felt no pain or other sensations, but was absolutely terrified. So fearful was he that he longed for his life to end in that moment. As for Calvin, he was having a horrifying experience of his own. Unable to speak or move, he claimed to have floated to the door of the craft and inside into a very bright room. There, he was laid on a table at a 45-degree angle by one of the grey wrinkled beings, before being left alone in the room, after which he experienced a series of clicking noises, as well as a blue-looking square box about the size of a deck of cards, which moved around his body. Seemingly similar to Charles's concurrent experience, Calvin's entire body was scanned. He then supposedly encountered a different sort of being, smaller and less ugly than the others. This one, so he described in his 2018 book, somehow made him feel safe, even telepathically expressing to him not to be afraid. Further examination proceeded, after which Calvin again experienced a sensation of floating before finding himself reunited with Charles Hickson on the riverbank, almost to the exact same spot, only thoroughly traumatized by their ordeal.
After the encounter had happened, they actually sat down and said, "What are we going to do?" And Calvin was absolutely certain, "We are not going to tell anybody. They will think we are nuts." He was getting married in November, and as his bride-to-be was only 16, he was 18, he needed parental consent. And he says, if my fiancé's father finds out about this, there's no way he's going to let me marry. He'll think he's marrying a lunatic. So they originally set off to go home to Charlie's place and not say anything. Charlie said, no, we got to tell somebody. So they came up with a compromise. And that Calvin would say, "Yes, I saw the UFO. I'll tell them that I saw the creatures come out of the door, but that is it. I'm not telling them. I'll tell them at that point I passed out." And he was literally, shaking like a leaf. Charlie, on the other hand, although he was scared, he'd actually fought. He'd been in combat in the Korean War, so he'd got life skills to fall back on that Calvin didn't. So when they reported their encounter to the sheriff that night, they stuck to the claim that Calvin, passed out.
So it was a mixture then of wanting to stay out of the public eye and not wanting to be ridiculed, but also what happened that night was quite terrifying, from what I understand, for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is the so-called secret tape made at the sheriff's department that night, and they're interviewed separately, and then they're put in a room together. And the deputy says, "I'll be back in a minute." Unbeknown to Charlie and Calvin, there's a tape recorder playing in the desk next to them. And 5 minutes later, the deputy comes back, takes something out of the drawer. They've no idea what it is. And they go and play it back, thinking, well, have them here. They were laughing and joking while they've been on their own. And of course, it was exactly the opposite. Calvin was almost in tears. He was crawling up the walls. He was saying his prayers, saying, "I want to see a doctor. I just want to get something for my nerves." And that changed law enforcement's attitude once they heard that. They then tended to believe them. So yeah, he really did suffer traumatically.
In this way, despite the attempt to keep the younger man's side of the story shielded from the public, Calvin subsequently suffered a nervous breakdown. Taken to the emergency room, he threw a wheelchair against a desk before being restrained by hospital security guards and sedated. He simply couldn't stand the stress of what he had experienced. And so, after discussing with his now wife, Waynette, he decided to leave Pascagoula and start afresh.
He got married, had a family, and when somebody said, "Oh, you the alien man, can we have an interview?" he'd say, "Oh God, not again." And he would literally pack up and say, "We're moving." In one place he lived, for example, he even changed his name. And his boss called him in one day and said, "You're fired." He says, "Well, I haven't done anything wrong." So, "Well, your name doesn't match your social security number." Yeah. And he never told his story in full. He made he told it right at the beginning to Dr. Hynek. And but that was it.
Indeed, the ongoing trauma of all that he went through that night in Pascagoula even cost him his marriage. After 7 years and 1 daughter, Calvin and Waynette got a divorce. "We had no private life," he explained in his 2018 book. "I would go to work and the press would just follow me." Fortunately, the couple reunited and remarried in 1996. The same issues still present, but both older and wiser, and thus better equipped to navigate the storm together. Certainly, Calvin credited his wife with being a big reason why he decided to ultimately write his book and get the true story out there. And so, in 2018, the full details of Calvin's side of the story finally came out. When they did, the incredible happened. Others, many others, came forward claiming that they too had seen something otherworldly on the Pascagoula River that October. The most incredible of all the testimonies came from a lady called Maria Blair.
When Calvin's book was written, he came out and he did some local media and he did national and international media. And there was one little 8-minute sort of kind of mini documentary that Calvin did with one of the news companies. Somebody put it on YouTube. And there's a comment there. And in fact, I read it again the other day. It says, "My mum and dad were on the other side of the river that night. They too saw the UFO." Words to that effect. And that naturally grabbed my attention. So I managed to find this person on social media. It was a young lady. And I explained who I was. And I said, "Would your mum and dad talk to us, please?" And of course, her mum and dad were Mr. and Mrs. Blair. And they were happy to talk to her. I got them on the phone. And it was Maria Blair. Maria said, "Yeah, my husband used to work offshore. He'd work on the oil rigs. And we were on the other side of the river that night in our car by a local pier. There was a boat there ready to take us out, but we're waiting for my husband's boss. It was late."
Maria Blair went on to explain how, whilst waiting for the arrival of the boat, she and her husband Jerry saw what she at first thought was an airplane because of its bright lights flashing. Blue in colour, it moved back and forth across the sky, seemingly lost. This was around 9 o'clock in the evening on the 11th of October 1973, and she and her husband were on the opposite side of the river to Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Incredible, to say the least. However, there was more to the Blair's story. Through further discussion with Philip Mantle and his co-author Dr. Irena Scott, it became clear that this was not just a UFO sighting.
There was a big splash in the pier next to them, and this creature came up out of the water. It went back down again and didn't come back up, and she was absolutely terrified. And Mrs. Blair went on to say that they walked down the pier. They decided to put her husband's clothes on the boat. She literally chucked them on. And now she said this was around about 9 o'clock. She didn't stay long because this thing had terrified her, and she ran back down to get to the car. And when she got there, it was 12 o'clock.
And so Maria Blair had not only seen a figure in the water, but had missing time too, something which, all the world over, is considered to be a telltale sign of alien abduction. In time, and after further discussions with Dr. Scott and Philip Mantle, Maria began to remember more about her experience that night, with her becoming more and more convinced that, just like Calvin and Charles, she had experienced something impossible. As for her husband Jerry, whilst he was reluctantly willing to admit that he had seen the blue illuminated craft over the water, he did not corroborate Maria's sighting of there having been a humanoid figure in and emerging from the water. Before too long, however, that would all change.
Mr. Blair eventually took seriously ill.
Yeah.
And quite literally, he was in the hospital, sitting on his hospital bed, ready for an operation the next day, and he made his wife Maria filmed me, and he said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Mantle, I lied. I saw exactly what my wife saw. I seen it. I seen the creature." And Maria also filmed it on her cell phone, so we have him talking. And he's sat on his bed he's got the stickers on from his ECG, no top on.
What did you think of that?
Well, it's almost like a deathbed confession.
And so it was, in a dramatic series of events, that Maria Blair's sighting of a humanoid figure in the water was corroborated, which, in combination with the missing time, supported an uncomfortable and incredible implication. That of a double alien abduction that night on the Pascagoula River. Not merely of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, but of a second set of two people, Maria and Jerry Blair, on the opposite bank of the river. Jerry Blair survived his hospital admission. He was, however, on the decline and before too long passed away. Before then, his wife was able to document, with great difficulty due to her husband's rapidly declining health, more of what he saw that night. Supposedly, he witnessed multiple figures, describing them as having been 6 feet tall and grey in colour. According to Maria's notes, 2 of them grabbed him and got control of him, after which they took him to a spaceship, where they performed an exam on him that he didn't want. As for Maria, she only remembered being outside of the craft, seeing bright, clear lights that were so bright that they hurt your eyes to look at them. The more she spoke with Jerry, though, as well as with Dr. Irena Scott and Philip Mantle, the more she supposedly remembered, until, after Jerry's death, she stated she wanted to undergo hypnotic regression so as to unlock the remainder of that night.
She came back to us after her husband had passed away and wanted hypnosis, because she was obviously upset at losing her husband. So time passed again, and she mentioned it again to us, and I said, well, I'll see what I can do. I'm several thousand miles away on the other side of the Atlantic, by the way, But I found a professional hypnotherapist who would do regression and would come out to your location as well. So we did it at Calvin Parker's house. But what we didn't tell the hypnotherapist anything, not a thing. We just wanted to take Mrs. Blair back to a time and a place and a location. And that is it. And that's what we did. And, the hypnotherapist was stunned.
For certainly, Maria Blair, in a state of altered consciousness, was able to recall and provide details of a shocking interaction with apparent alien beings. "I've never seen anything like that," Maria began, hypnotized, speaking of the being that she saw that night. "It grabs me." Guided by the hypnotherapist, she then went on to explain how she was floating and experienced muffled sound. Restrained, held still, she was under the control of a strange being. The entire regression was extensively documented by Philip Mantle and Dr. Irena Scott, filmed professionally with photographs and the full transcript included in their 2023 book Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Strange and at times eerie, it was as though the beings who took Maria Blair were employing some sort of dark magic, even in that moment, to prevent her from accessing certain parts of her memory, with the hypnotherapist, so the transcript reveals, having to push past blockages to allow Maria to be able to regain control over her own memories. "It has control of me," Maria whimpered. "They're laying me on a table and they don't want me to know what they are doing." As the session progressed, Maria was able to break through the seeming mental block to tell the hypnotherapist, "They want my eggs. They put me out. I have no control of what they do. What they're doing is collecting my DNA and my eggs."
She said these creatures were interested in her eggs and her DNA, and that they wanted to make a creature that could walk on Earth and look just like us and go unnoticed. Which, to be honest, none of us ever even dreamt of she'd say anything like this.
In this way, considering all that she remembered and had revealed under hypnotic regression, Maria Blair came to believe that she was the real target that night, and that Calvin and Charles were the collateral damage of her extraterrestrial encounter. She and her husband were, after all, supposed to be at the river, at that place and at that time that night, whereas Charles and Calvin's plans had been made informally on their way home from work. Undoubtedly, all of this is not merely highly terrifying, but highly sensational and difficult to believe also. Obviously, some of the things that Maria brought up via her regressive hypnosis, they're quite controversial even by the standards of UFOs and extraterrestrials, the idea of an alien-human hybrid. What are your thoughts on how compelling that aspect is?
Well, what Dr. Scott and I decided to do, we didn't think of a book, we were just researching it at one point, and what we'd done, what we realised is we just write articles, and we wrote several articles about the ongoing research and investigation. But you can only write so many articles. So we decided perhaps it might be best to put all this in a book and allow the reader to decide for themselves. So we wouldn't hide anything. I mean, literally nothing. The idea of the book with its title is, here is our research, here is our evidence. Our only conclusion is that something really bizarre did happen that night. But you, the reader, you are your own jury. You know, we're not out to indoctrinate anyone. You make of it what you will, because I know hypnosis on its own is very controversial.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that, your thoughts
on that. Well, we didn't want them to undergo hypnosis. It was something Maria wanted herself. And so we obliged. It's one of those cases where it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. You know, if you don't publish it and somebody finds out and they'll say, "Oh, what are you hiding?" You know, if you do publish it, some people might say, well, hypnosis is a lot of rubbish. So it's a bit like taking a polygraph test. You know, Charlie Hickson took a polygraph test, you know, within a couple of weeks of the incident happened, and he passed. So the critics say, well, polygraphs are not admissible in court. Had he failed it, they would have called him a liar, you know. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. But it's all there, all the witness testimony, all the documents we could find, including the hypnosis, in full.
And certainly there is abundant evidence to examine in regards to the Pascagoula abduction case. In Philip Mantle and Dr. Irena Scott's book, innumerable additional witnesses and their testimonies are recorded. From those who saw strange lights whilst driving along nearby Highway 90, to a then young man who observed changes to the vegetation on the riverbank the day after Charles and Calvin reported their close encounter.
Where this UFO was, there was no vegetation there, but there was some to the side of it. We have interviewed, I think it's either 4 or 5 individuals who claim to have seen damage in this vegetation. It's really tall grass. The grass has a name, but this grass gets, 7 foot tall. You know, all things are bigger in America, aren't they? Even the grass, you know. I'll give you an example. One young guy, he's not young now, but he said back in those days, on a Saturday morning, my mum and dad would have a sleep in, and I was allowed to watch cartoons on the TV. So we'd heard on the Friday, the day after, that this thing had happened. So he said, my mum and dad are asleep. I put the TV set on and left the cartoons on and got on my bicycle and went and fetched a friend, and we bicycled to the location. And he said they were making their way through this tall grass. And he said, we just come along a part of it and that was gone. And it wasn't cut down, it wasn't burnt, it was just not there. And we've had several people report similar things. But what we do have is a lot of eyewitnesses, and people say, well, it's anecdotal evidence. Yeah, but anecdotal evidence is still admissible in court. And if there's enough of it, it can put you behind bars if you've been, naughty, so to speak.
And in many ways, this case does have enough of it. In addition to some 30 to 40 witnesses, in the course of researching his book, Philip Mantle was able to uncover compelling documentary and photographic evidence previously considered lost.
When I first started working with Calvin, I said to him, have you got any documents, photographs, anything? He says, no, nothing. He'd been hit by Hurricane Katrina. His house was under 10 or 12 feet of water, and everything's gone. So, okay. So one of my jobs was to pester people politely and ask them if they got anything. Now, Hynek was down there. It was only later on that year that Hynek founded the Centre for UFO Studies. So it seemed an obvious place to start. They sent me a PDF file, mostly newspaper cuttings, but they were useful. And then in the middle of them, there was a one-page typewritten document written on an old typewriter, stated October the 13th, 1973. So it's 2 days after the encounter. And it talks about both Parker and Hickson being stripped down to their underwear and given the once-over. And he says there were puncture wounds on Hickson's arm and on Calvin Parker's foot. Both of these individuals had reported feeling these minor injuries during their encounter. And it mentioned on the bottom some photographs. Well, there were no photographs there, but this document was fascinating. And I think it was maybe a year or 2 years later, I got an email from the same gentleman at the Centre for UFO Studies. He says, Philip, I've been rooting through some files today and I come across these. I'm sure you've already got them, but I thought I'd send them just in case, And hey, presto, it was the photographs to accompany that document. And we know who it is because these are photographs and they've been scanned on both sides, and on the back of the photograph is the name of the person. So there you see, and these are very, very minor injuries on Charlie's forearm and on Calvin's foot.
Incredibly, the injuries displayed in the photographs, although minor, are consistent with the testimonies provided by both Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson in 1973. For example, Charles described feeling a pain in his left arm when two of the beings grabbed him so as to take him aboard the craft. As for Calvin, it was whilst he was on board that he claimed something was stuck into his foot by the alien creatures.
Make of it what you will. These are not laser incisions or anything like that. They are minor injuries.
So you did get a couple of doctors, I think, to have a look at them as well.
Yeah. It's difficult because all we're looking at is photographs, but I did seek medical advice, but there's not a lot you can do with a couple of old black and white photographs. We've since had them colorized, but it's a physical link to what may have happened that night.
And so, once again, seemingly abundant evidence that something strange did indeed happen to both Calvin and Charles that night. Speaking more generally, I wanted to ask Philip what his opinion was on the Pascagoula case as a whole, and how what is now indisputably a classic incident reflects upon the broader subject of UFOs and extraterrestrials.
And, I don't know what more we can do. It's almost the perfect case. It really is. And we should be taking more note of it. Because when do you stop? Are you looking for the next perfect case? Well, what's the point? We've already got one here,
Even so, as almost perfect as this case is, there can be said to be one glaring missing element: motive. Whilst Maria Blair has postulated that her abduction experience related to some manner of alien-human hybridization agenda, the broader reason for why Charles Hickson was exposed to the scanning eye in the wall of the craft, and why Calvin Parker was left traumatized by a similarly invasive medical examination, eludes. Just speculating for a moment, if we're going to say that these were actually extraterrestrial beings. Why might they have done this, do you think?
Well, this is the thing about the subject across the world. I mean, one of the I run my own publishing outfit called Flying Disc Press. The second book I published was called UFOs over Romania by Dr. Dan Farkas. And what puzzled Dan was the stupid things that the creatures do. It doesn't seem to make any sense to do some stupid things. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would aliens come from wherever, pick up two fishermen, prod them around, put them back, and then, hey presto? I don't have an answer. I wish I did. I can't even say the word aliens. Calvin called them aliens for the sake of calling them something. Somebody said, well, you know, the subtitle of your book is The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. It's because that's what these experiences are better known as. I couldn't put the Pascagoula weird and unknown experience. It wouldn't sound really stupid. You know, I sit on the fence. I honestly don't know. Calvin was just looking for an answer right up to the day he died. And if I could have found a rational explanation that covered everything that we found, I would have been a happy man, and so would Calvin. But I just can't find one.
And ultimately, this might just be the most compelling aspect of the Pascagoula case. Its humanity. Not merely how, in all of its complexity and intrigue, it has had the power to enthrall researchers like Philip Mantle for the past 5 decades, but also how it represents one man's struggle to find out what happened to him one night as a young man on the threshold of married life, on that one night that forever changed the course of his life. Calvin Parker did not seek, welcome, or enjoy what happened to him. For many years, he ran from it. And that was because it was very real to him. Confusing, complex, terrifying, but very real. It was the early hours of the morning of the 12th of November 1976, and soldiers were on sentry duty at the Spanish Air Force base at Talavera La Real when they heard a strange and piercing sound. At first akin to typical radio interference, the noise is said to have evolved to become an acute, penetrating whistle, so loud and uncomfortable that it forced the soldiers to abandon their posts and investigate the area. Their search ultimately led them to a forest, and a 10 feet tall luminous figure which seemed to consist entirely of small points of light. Frightening and faceless, it stood before the soldiers as they fired their weapons at it, only for it to fade and vanish. Odd lights were also seen in the sky above the base that night, with the case of the Talavera entity going on to be investigated by both the Air Force and UFO experts, with their conclusions suggesting that something very strange did indeed take place, with unidentified flying objects and quite possibly their occupants now whispered to have visited the area both that night in 1976 and at other times throughout the 20th century. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. And stay to the end of this video to find out about my upcoming meet and greet. The Talavera La Real Air Base is located close to the Spanish-Portuguese border, just outside the medieval city of Badajoz. Whilst the province's history is rich in many ways, it boasts a surprising fame when it comes to UFO and extraterrestrial sightings, with Valencian Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos, a veteran UFO researcher and author who played a key role in the declassification of Spanish Air Force UFO files in the 1990s, stating that the area has accounted for no less than 35% of Spanish case studies over a 50-year period, from 1950 to 1999. Its most famous story to date is undoubtedly that of the Talavera entity, a case which not only involved both UFOs and an alleged craft occupant, but made its way into the very Air Force files Ballester Olmos and others worked to declassify. For indeed, not only was the strangeness witnessed by multiple on-the-record Air Force personnel, including 3 airmen and an officer, it was also investigated by the higher-ups. Jose Maria Trejo and Juan Carrizosa Lujan were on sentry duty in the fuel stock zone of the Talavera Larel Air Force Base and Jet Aircraft School just outside of Badajoz. Each positioned within a sentry box some 60 meters apart, both airmen expected a usual night of sentinel work. And yet, around 1:45 a.m., they heard what they later described to researcher Juan Jose Benitez as an acute penetrating whistle, so piercing that it hurt our ears. It lasted for no more than 5 minutes before ceasing, only for it to begin again shortly afterwards, this time close to Trejo's position. Concerned there was an intruder attempting to access the fuel stock zone, Trejo called for the other sentry to come over and help him search the area. According to the Flying Saucer Review article in which the case featured sometime later, both airmen were equipped with loaded weapons, standard issue Z62 rifles. In spite of their searching, the airmen could not find anything, and so returned to their stations. Once again, however, the noise returned, with the men reporting how they thought they were either mad or would be driven mad by the sharp and penetrating sound. Each time the noise returned, it seemed to last for around 5 minutes before stopping. Each time, the men were left clueless as to its origin. It was at this point, frustrated by the sound, that the 2 Spanish sentries had their attention caught by something else. A light high in the sky above them. Similar in appearance to a flare, it has been described as having illuminated a wide area in the direction of Badajoz, lasting a mere 15 or 20 seconds before disappearing. Soon afterwards, a 3rd sentry by the name of Jose Hidalgo appeared. He, like Trejo and Lujan, had seen the strange glowing light in the sky in the course of his watch. Increasingly concerned as to what was going on, the 3 airmen decided to alert a nearby corporal, who thus sounded the alarm and arranged for support guards to perform a general sweep of the area. As part of this, the 3 original sentries, Trejo, Lujan and Hidalgo, returned to the fuel stockpile along with one of the airbase's German Shepherd guard dogs. All is said to have been silent as they continued on, following the base's boundary wall in the pitch-black night. It was as the men were approaching a new under-construction sentry box that they are claimed to have experienced yet another strangeness, some manner of whirlwind. Described by Trejo as localized in one spot, the anomalous force caused the airmen to stop. The guard dog that was with them, despite being military trained, was oddly unresponsive. This would soon change, however, when the sound of branches being broken came from a nearby plantation of eucalyptus trees. The dog was released into the forest, only for him to return a few seconds later, strange and staggering. It was as though the animal was seasick, one of the sentries later told the reporter, almost as though he was reacting to someone or something having attacked, thrashed, and terrified him. We were baffled, so the airman's translated testimony continued. 4 or 5 times we got the dog to go back to the eucalyptus trees, and every time he came back in just the same way. His ears seemed to be hurting, he was whimpering. Then, when he returned to us for the last time, he started circling around us. According to the Flying Saucer Review article on the case, this was a sign from the military-trained animal that there was a danger which threatened the airmen. The dog was, in short, placing itself as a physical barrier between the men and whatever it had encountered in the trees. And so, increasingly worried for their safety, the 3 sentries shouted into the eucalyptus plantation, demanding whoever was in there to reveal themselves. No one appeared. Instead, the dog continued to circle and snarl, faster and increasingly agitated. It was then that one of the men, Jose Maria Trejo, reported experiencing a sensation of there being someone behind him. Chills raced through his body, encouraging him to turn slightly. and so it was that he supposedly saw a greenish light out of the corner of his eye. Turning fully now, he is said to have beheld the most fantastic thing he had ever seen in his life, some manner of giant luminous figure emerging from the trees. According to the description provided by the men, the figure was humanoid and stood at least 3 meters or 10 feet tall. Peculiarly, it seemed to be made up of many small points of light, which appeared brighter closer to the entity's periphery. Its body was thick, and its arms were long and crossed. On its head, the giant apparition seemed to be wearing some sort of equally luminous helmet. As far as the men could tell, it was standing on the ground rather than floating above it. Despite having his weapon loaded and in hand, an utterly horrified Trejo was unable to do anything to protect himself. Indeed, according to his testimony, he began to feel a sensation of general weakness, which ultimately led him to fall to the ground against his will. Before he hit the floor, he managed to shout to his fellow sentries, "Down, they'll kill us." And so it was that Lujan and Hidalgo opened fire on the colossal light being. Trejo struggled to watch the confrontation unfold from the ground, conscious but stuck, his vision starting to fail inexplicably. Almost the instant the firing started, there was said to have been a bright light akin to that of a photographer's flash, and the figure in that flash of light faded suddenly, then vanished. Lujan and Hidalgo rushed to Trejo's aid, helping him from the ground. Speaking of his experience some 1.5 years later, the airman had this to say: "It's strange, it was only when I tried to press the trigger of my rifle that I started to fall. It seemed as though that being had guessed my intentions, but how could that be possible? Indeed, how could such a thing be possible?" Whatever the case, the luminous entity was gone, as was, strangely, all of the bullets that the 2 airmen had fired at it. For, as soon as there was enough daylight, airbase personnel conducted a thorough search of the conflict area. Not a single cartridge case could be found anywhere on the ground, despite a total of 40 to 50 having been fired. Likewise, no bullets were located, despite the wall of the base being close to where the entity had stood. The walls should have shown the marks of most of the shots, unless, of course, the giant luminous being had taken them with it when it disappeared. The bullets and the cartridges, somehow. According to the report on the case, the men's rifles were thoroughly inspected by Air Force experts. They had been fired. The bullets had been spent. Indeed, the additional guards who had been summoned by the corporal in order to sweep the area had heard the shooting, having arrived at the spot soon after Lujan and Hidalgo had helped Trejo from the ground. What the men had fired at was, however, a mystery. And as if the Talavera incident wasn't sensational enough already, a few days later Jose Trejo had to be taken to hospital when his eyesight failed again. Similar to his experience on the ground before the 10-feet humanoid, he experienced a slow fade of his vision and then total blindness. He also lost consciousness, with the airman subsequently spending a total of 15 days under medical observation. 5 at the sickbay on the base, and then 10 at nearby Badajoz Hospital. There he underwent many tests, including x-rays, blood work, sight and hearing examinations. Nothing could uncover the reason for his sudden blindness and mysterious loss of consciousness. A similar medical incident was to repeat only a few days after his release from hospital. On that occasion, Trejo described having to be helped out of the car by his girlfriend when his vision once again failed. On the 30th of November, some 2 weeks after the incident, he was moved to Madrid and the Air Force hospital there. He remained at the hospital for 1 full month. Unable once more to come up with an explanation for the young airman's abnormal symptoms, the doctors stated he had suffered a nervous maladjustment. At the time of speaking to a reporter in 1978, Trejo was 21 years old and in a state of perfect health. Whatever the reason for his mysterious episodes of blindness in the aftermath of his encounter with the light being, he ultimately recovered. As for the military report on the incident, researcher Vicente Juan Ballesta Olmos has stated that the episode was never considered by the command of the base as a UFO-type event. Instead, so the UFO expert has claimed, the event has all the traces of hallucinatory delirium by a person with a psychiatric history, combined with contagious hysteria, fear, and confusion. And yet, in addition to there being no suggestion of psychiatric history, the three men also had no doubt whatsoever about what they had seen at the time, going on the record to state that the thing was something very much like a man, but very tall, and had been clearly seen by all three of them. There was, in their minds, no hallucinations or delirium of which to speak. And certainly the Spanish airmen's claims are not inconsistent when one considers the wider field of UFO sightings and extraterrestrial encounters. In terms of the Rendlesham Forest incident, which took place only a few years after the one at Talavera La Real in December 1980, the personnel who approached the glowing triangular craft reported in the woods just beyond RAF Woodbridge's East Gate, Sergeant Jim Peniston and Airman John Burrows described how they instinctually threw themselves to the forest floor at the sight of the anomaly. Similar to Jose Trejo, they experienced odd physical sensations, including an uncertainty as to whether or not they still had control over their bodies. And, increasingly comparable, the British airbase incident happened at a similar time of year and a similar time of morning to that of the Spanish Talavera La Real case. Elsewhere in the world again, notorious paranormal hotspot Skinwalker Ranch boasts reports of oversized creatures emerging from other dimensions and being impervious to bullets, in perhaps the same way that the Talavera entity was immune to those fired by the airmen. The Utah Ranch's bulletproof wolf, for example, is said to have been shot at multiple times by then-owner Terry Sherman. The creature was unfazed and, alongside many other extraordinary and indescribable entities, continued to haunt the family as they experienced a multitude of other oddities, including strange, seemingly sentient lights in the sky. And thus, for all their bizarreness, monstrous bulletproof cryptids being reported at UFO hotspots are not unheard of. One can even speak of the 1967 experiences of American Robert Salas and the early hours missile shutdown at Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls, Montana. Not only that, the province in which the Talavera La Real sighting occurred, Badajoz, has a legacy of similarly anomalous happenings. Only a few months before the appearance of the luminous light being, for example, an operator in the control tower of the airbase is said to have detected anomalies which were duly logged and filed away by the Air Force. Then, earlier still, in 1967, the pilots of a plane heading to the Talavera base and flying over a northeasterly town claimed to have observed a strange, shape-changing object in the sky close to them. Given the recurring relationship between aerial anomalies and Air Force activities, one is free to speculate why personnel like Trejo, Lujan and Hidalgo continue to report strange sightings and encounters. Whilst, undoubtedly, not all will be as otherworldly as they are claimed, it is surely too great of a coincidence for all to be the simple product of hallucinatory delirium, contagious hysteria, fear and/or confusion. For those who fight for disclosure, it is hoped that the truth will one day be revealed. Until that time, all we can do is wait and watch, and perhaps catch sight for ourselves of the strangeness that, on occasion, is said to emerge from the darkness, bulletproof and luminous. Thank you so much for watching. I very much hope you enjoyed this video. If you did and are new to my channel, you might like to explore some of my other videos, including the ones linked on screen now. Equally, I have more content for you to enjoy over on my second channel, Laura Rowton.